Hey everyone, and welcome back to History Simplified. Today, we're talking about that time when the greatest conqueror in Western history died suddenly and left the world as biggest empire. To his friends, think of it as the most chaotic corporate succession crisis ever, where the VPs don't just send angry emails, they raise armies and invent new ways to betray each other. We are boiling down 40 years of backstabbing, megalomania, and ancient subtweets into a single, highly caffeinated rant. Historians, you might want to look away now, before the inevitable betrayal starts. If you enjoy this highly inaccurate but fun version of history, please hit that like and subscribe button. Seriously, it helps us buy more silly hats for the next video. Alright, grab some popcorn. Things are about to get unnecessarily complicated. Our story begins in Babylon, in June of 323 BC. The air is thick with humidity, incense, and the palpable stench of political panic. Alexander the Great, the man who had sprinted from Greece to India and conquered everything in between, was dying. At just 32 years old, the living god, the military genius, the man who had never lost a battle, had been taken down by a fever and a whole lot of wine. His body, which had survived countless spears, swords, and arrows, was finally giving up. And as he lay there, sweating and delirious, his entire world held its breath. This wasn't just a king dying, it was a supernova collapsing. He had built an empire stretching from the Adriatic Sea to the Himalayas, and he had done it so fast, with such overwhelming personal force, that nobody had ever bothered to ask the terrifyingly simple question: what happens when he has gone? He had no plan. Let that sink in. The man who could choreograph a multi-continental invasion had zero succession strategy. His inner circle, his 7 closest generals and companions known as the Somatophylakes, crowded his chambers. These weren't just soldiers. They were the board of directors for the largest enterprise on Earth. There was Ptolemy, the cautious, clever friend who was already thinking 10 moves ahead. There was Perdiccas, the ambitious chief of staff, the man with the clipboard and a deep-seated belief that he should be running the show. And there were others, a whole cast of hardened, absurdly competent military men who had spent the last decade watching their friend become a living deity. Now, he was just a man, gasping for air, and the future was a terrifying blank. Legend has it that in his final moments, his generals begged him, "To whom do you leave your kingdom?" Alexander, ever the drama queen, supposedly rasped out his final words, "Te kratistai," to the strongest. Historians are pretty sure this never happened, but it's the most brilliant piece of historical fan fiction ever conceived. Because whether he said it or not, it's exactly what happened next. He might as well have tossed a live grenade into the room and whispered, "Have fun, boys." With his last breath, he handed his signet ring to Perdiccas, a gesture that screamed, "You're in charge for now," and then he was gone. The center of the world had just vanished. Cue absolute, unmitigated chaos. The second Alexander's heart stopped, the empire fractured along a dozen different fault lines. The first and most immediate crack was between the generals themselves, the elite cavalry officers, and the rank-and-file infantry. The generals, led by Perdiccas, were pragmatists. They knew Alexander's wife, the Bactrian princess Roxana, was pregnant. Their plan: wait, if she has a son, bingo, we have an heir, Alexander IV. We'll set up a regency, run things ourselves for the child, and maintain the empire. It was a neat, tidy plan that kept all the power right where they wanted it, in their hands. But the infantry, the thousands of grizzled Macedonian foot soldiers, had a very different idea. They were traditionalists. They didn't give a damn about some unborn, half-Bactrian baby. They wanted a king with Argead blood, a real Macedonian, and they wanted one now. Their candidate was Alexander's half-brother, Philip Aridaeus. There was just one tiny problem. Philip was intellectually disabled. He was a symbol, a warm body with the right bloodline, but he was in no condition to rule a city, let alone the known world. This was the first great debate, the pragmatic, elitist choice of an unborn heir versus the traditionalist, populist choice of a disabled one. The situation spiraled into a near-civil war right there in the streets of Babylon. The infantry proclaimed Philip Aridaeus as King Philip III, defying the generals. They stormed the palace, ready to fight their own commanders. For a moment, it looked like Alexander's empire would devour itself before his body was even cold. This is where the first gloriously dysfunctional compromise of this entire era was born. This whole saga is built on terrible compromises to avoid mutual annihilation. The two sides agreed to the single worst power-sharing deal in history. The cause and effect chain was brutal and swift. Cause: Alexander's death creates an immediate power vacuum with no legitimate, capable adult heir. Effect: the cavalry commanders push to wait for his unborn son, while the infantry demands his disabled half-brother take the throne immediately. Consequence: they decide to have both. They created a joint monarchy, with King Philip III and the soon-to-be-born King Alexander IV as co-rulers. Let's just pause and appreciate the sheer absurdity of this. The throne of the largest empire on earth was now occupied by a man who couldn't govern himself, and an infant who hadn't even been born yet. It was a masterclass in kicking the can down the road. The decision solved the immediate problem of a civil war in Babylon, but it created a much larger, long-term one. It established a government with a hollow center, a crown without a head. This meant that whoever was named regent, the official guardian, and administrator for the helpless kings, would wield all the actual power of the empire. And the man holding that job, thanks to that signet ring, was Perdiccas. He was now the most powerful man in the world. He was also the man with the biggest target painted on his back. They had a solution, but it was a solution that guaranteed future conflict. The empire was notionally united, but its leaders were already calculating the odds. So, Perdiccas is the new boss. He's the imperial regent, the commander of the royal army, and the babysitter-in-chief to a king who can tie his own shoes and another who is still a fetus. He has the power, the title, and the fancy ring. But as he looked around the room at Alexander's other generals, he saw a pack of wolves pretending to be golden retrievers. They were all smiling and nodding, swearing loyalty to the Arged throne. But their eyes were fixed on the exits, already calculating the fastest route to building their own personal empires. This flimsy compromise needed structure, and fast. What followed was the partition of Babylon, which sounds like a very serious geopolitical event, but was basically the world's most high-stakes group project assignment. The official story was that they were just assigning satrapies' provinces to temporary governors, who would administer them on behalf of the kings. The unspoken reality was that they were divvying up the spoils of a decade of conquest. This wasn't an administrative meeting. It was a feeding frenzy disguised by paperwork. Perdiccas, standing at the head of the table, began handing out the keys to the kingdom. First, and most importantly, was the heartland, Macedon and Greece, the bedrock of the empire and its primary source of angry, spear-wielding soldiers, were to be jointly managed by the old guard, Antipater and Craterus. Antipater was already there. The grumpy old regent Alexander had left behind to keep the home front quiet. Craterus, universally respected and the army's favorite, was still marching tens of thousands of veterans home from India. This duo was meant to be the empire's stable European anchor. Then the carving of Asia began. Lysimachus, a tough, brutish brawler of a man, was given Thrace. This was the wild northern frontier, a perpetually troublesome region full of warrior tribes. It was like being assigned nightclub security for the entire continent. It was a hard, thankless job, but it gave him an independent army and a buffer zone, a perfect fit. Antigonus the One-Eyed, a veteran commander of Philip II's generation, and an absolute beast on the battlefield, was given a huge swath of western Anatolia. This was prime real estate, rich in resources and strategically vital. Antigonus was already a powerhouse, and this just handed him more soldiers, more money, and a very large chip to play in the games to come. But the slickest move of the entire meeting came from Ptolemy. While others might have clamored for the biggest territories, Ptolemy, the cool historian and calculating strategist, asked for just one province, Egypt, on a map. It didn't look like much compared to the vast expanses of Asia, but it was a masterstroke of geopolitical genius. Egypt was fabulously wealthy, with its annual Nile floods creating endless grain surpluses. It was geographically isolated, protected by vast deserts to the east and west, the sea to the north and cataracts to the south. It was, in short, a fortress that paid for itself. Ptolemy wasn't trying to win the first round. He was setting himself up to survive all of them. He was building a bunker, stocking the pantry, and bolting the door. Meanwhile, Perdiccas made a crucial decision for himself. As regent, he wouldn't take a personal satrapy. He was above such petty, regional concerns. His province was the entire empire. He retained command of the elite royal army, the unstoppable military force that had crushed Persia. He also kept the kings with him, making him the sole source of legitimate imperial authority. In his mind, he wasn't one of the governors. He was their overlord. This was a massive gamble. He had all the authority on paper, but he lacked a secure, personal geographic power base to retreat to if things went south. His power was mobile, but it was also rootless. And then there was Eumenes of Cardia, the brilliant Greek secretary, Alexander's chief administrator, the ultimate outsider in a room full of swaggering Macedonian warriors. He was loyal, competent, and universally disrespected for not being a real Macedonian, Perdiccas assigned him the provinces of Cappadocia and Paphlagonia. Great, the only catch, they hadn't actually been conquered yet. A local Persian dynast was still running the place. Perdiccas essentially told him, "Congratulations on your promotion. Your first task is to invade a mountain kingdom with an army you don't have yet. Good luck." This move served two purposes. It rewarded a loyal ally while also conveniently sending him on a high-risk, faraway mission where he might conveniently fail. The whole arrangement was a masterpiece of passive aggression and transparent self-interest. The cause and effect chain was simple and deadly. Cause: the empire requires a formal administrative structure to function after Alexander's death. Effect: the partition of Babylon assigns the most powerful generals to the wealthiest and most strategic provinces, ostensibly as loyal governors. Consequence: this act of decentralization instantly creates multiple semi-independent power centers. Each general now had his own tax base, his own army, and a dawning realization that loyalty to the empire was a distant second to securing his own fiefdom. This meeting wasn't about preserving Alexander's legacy, it was about laying the legal groundwork for its dismantlement. They all swore oaths of allegiance to a pair of puppet kings. But the ink wasn't even dry before they were acting like absolute monarchs in their new domains. They were now the Diadochi, the successors. Though they didn't use that term yet, they were still pretending to be colleagues in a shared enterprise, but the project was already dead. They had successfully divided the labor, but in doing so, they had planted the seeds of their own wars. Everyone now had a corner of the world to call their own, a fortress to arm, and a rival to undermine. The fragile peace created in Babylon was nothing more than a ceasefire. It was the collective breath everyone took before the real fight began, and it wouldn't take long for someone to exhale. The partition of Babylon was less a peace treaty and more a starting gun fired in slow motion. For about 2 years, an uneasy calm settled over the empire. The generals, now styling themselves as satraps, scurried off to their newly assigned provinces. Ptolemy went to Egypt and immediately started acting less like a governor and more like a pharaoh. Antigonus began consolidating his power in Anatolia. Lysimachus started punching Thracian tribes. Everyone was busy setting up their own shop, stockpiling cash, and recruiting soldiers, all while sending polite, deferential letters back to the regent Perdiccas in Babylon. It was the ancient world's longest and most passive-aggressive text chain, but everyone knew this quiet was temporary. Someone, somewhere, was going to make a move so brazen it would force everyone else to show their hand. That someone was Ptolemy, and his move was one of the most gloriously petty and strategically brilliant acts of political theater in history. It all centered on Alexander's body in the ancient world. Burying your predecessor was a huge deal. It was a symbolic act of succession, a way of publicly declaring, "I am the rightful heir." Perdiccas knew this. As regent, he had custody of Alexander's corpse, which was his ultimate trump card. His plan was magnificent in its scope and arrogance. He commissioned a funeral carriage, a catafalque, of such absurd opulence it took 2 years to build. We're talking a massive golden temple on wheels, adorned with jewels and sculptures, pulled by 60 for mules. His intention was to parade this rolling monument from Babylon all the way back to Aegion, Macedon, the traditional burial place of Macedonian kings. It would be a PR tour to end all PR tours, a slow, majestic procession across the entire empire that would remind everyone just who was in charge. Perdiccas was literally driving legitimacy through every province. Ptolemy, down in his cozy Egyptian fortress, watched this plan unfold with alarm. He couldn't let that body reach Macedon. If it did, Antipater and Craterus would co-opt the ceremony, and the European heartland would become the center of imperial power. More importantly, Perdiccas would get the symbolic victory he so desperately craved. Ptolemy needed an anchor for his own ambitions, a symbol of legitimacy so powerful it could rival the living kings themselves. He needed Alexander, so he decided to steal him. As the gold-plated Greek mobile finally began its long journey west, Ptolemy made his move. In 321 BC, as the procession reached Syria, he rode out at the head of an army. He didn't attack. Not initially. He used persuasion. He intercepted the general in charge of the procession and presented him with a stunningly convenient piece of information. Alexander's dying wish, he claimed, was not to be buried in Macedon with his ancestors. No, his true desire was to be laid to rest in the Siwa oasis deep in the Egyptian desert. This was the spot where the oracle of Zeus Ammon had famously declared Alexander to be a son of the god. It was a lie, of course. A beautiful, audacious, politically perfect lie, backed up by a lot of men with very sharp spears. the commander of the escort, faced with a compelling argument in Ptolemy's army, suddenly saw the wisdom in this new plan. The world's most expensive funeral procession was officially hijacked. This act of grand theft necro was a political earthquake. Ptolemy rerouted the cortege south, taking Alexander's elaborately preserved body back to Memphis, the ancient capital of Egypt. He had done the unthinkable. He had stolen the founder of the dynasty. This wasn't just a political maneuver. It was a profound act of sacrilege and an open declaration of rebellion. He was telling Perdiccas and the entire world that he did not recognize the regent's authority. He was creating his own source of power, centered on the divine Alexander, right in the heart of his new kingdom. The body would later be moved to his new capital, Alexandria, where its tomb would become the Hellenistic world's most sacred shrine. The news hit Perdiccas like a thunderbolt. He was publicly and spectacularly humiliated. This was an insult that could not be ignored. If he let Ptolemy get away with stealing the single most important symbol of imperial unity, he would look weak. And in the cutthroat world of the Diadochi, looking weak was a death sentence. Every other satrap would take it as a green light to do whatever they wanted. Ptolemy's body-snatching gambit had turned a Cold War hot. Here is the chain reaction that lit the fuse on the First Great War. Cause: Ptolemy needs a supreme symbol of legitimacy to secure his independent rule in Egypt and undermine the regent. Effect: he brazenly hijacks Alexander the Great's funeral cortege, stealing the corpse and taking it to Egypt under a fabricated pretext. Consequence: this act is a direct and unforgivable challenge to Perdiccas' authority, leaving the regent with no choice but to launch a full-scale invasion of Egypt to punish Ptolemy and reclaim the body, thus initiating the First War of the Diadochi. This is the moment the pretense of friendship and loyalty completely evaporates. These men, who had fought side by side for a decade under the world's greatest general, were now going to war over his dead body. It was the most macabre game of capture the flag in human history, a conflict sparked not by a border dispute or a trade embargo, but by a heist. Perdiccas had no choice. He summoned the royal army, the kings, and his allies. He was going to march on Egypt, crush Ptolemy, and take back what was his. The world's worst group project was officially and violently over. So, Perdiccas was officially mad. Ptolemy had not only defied him, he had committed the ancient equivalent of stealing the Declaration of Independence and putting it in a private theme park. War was inevitable. Perdiccas began to gather the royal army, the elite, battle-hardened force that had steamrolled the Persian Empire. On paper, he had every advantage: the bigger army, the central authority of the regency, and possession of the two kings, which gave him the veneer of legitimacy. His plan was simple and direct: march to Egypt, storm the fortress of the Nile, crush Ptolemy into the dust, retrieve Alexander's body, and remind everyone who was in charge. There was just one problem: the empire was a very large, very messy place, filled with other ambitious men who were watching his every move. His primary concern was Europe. Back in Macedon, the old bulldog Antipater and the beloved general Craterus controlled the empire's heartland. Perdiccas couldn't just march his entire army south and leave his back exposed. He needed to make sure the European front was secure. And this is where his monumental ego, which until now had been a useful tool for ambition, became a catastrophic liability. He decided to play diplomat. It did not go well. The obvious move was an alliance. Antipater, seeing the writing on the wall, offered Perdiccas a deal, proposing a marriage between Perdiccas and his daughter, Nicaea. This was a sensible, pragmatic move. A marriage would seal a powerful alliance, unite the central imperial government with the European heartland, and isolate Ptolemy completely. Perdiccas would be free to deal with his Egyptian problem without worrying about getting stabbed in the back. Any sane person would have accepted immediately. Perdiccas, however, was not just any sane person. He was a man who was starting to get ideas. Just as this offer was on the table, another one arrived. This one came from the most formidable woman in the world, Olympias, Alexander the Great's mother. Living in exile, she was a master of political intrigue and hated Antipater with the fury of 1,000 suns. She offered Perdiccas something far more tempting than a simple alliance. She offered him the hand of her daughter, Cleopatra, Alexander the Great's full-blooded sister. The implications were explosive. Marrying Nicaea would make Perdiccas Antipater's son-in-law. Marrying Cleopatra would make him Alexander's brother-in-law, giving him a direct, personal connection to the royal bloodline. It was a stepping stone to claiming the throne for himself. Perdiccas' ego went into overdrive. He saw the crown dangling in front of him and he couldn't resist. But he also didn't want to immediately provoke Antipater. So, in a moment of spectacular political malpractice, He tried to have it both ways. He formally married Antipater's daughter Nicaea to keep him quiet for the moment, while secretly continuing negotiations for Cleopatra. It was a staggeringly clumsy and transparent deception. Antipater wasn't an idiot. Word got out instantly, and he was livid. He had offered an alliance and in return had his daughter used as a temporary placeholder. It wasn't just a political snub. It was a deeply personal insult. The bridge to Europe was not just burned, it was nuked from orbit. This single act of arrogance triggered a cascade of disaster. Perdiccas, blinded by royal ambition, publicly humiliates Antipater by jilting his daughter in favor of a potential marriage to Alexander's sister. Effect: a furious Antipater immediately turns from potential ally to mortal enemy. He forms a pact with the highly respected Craterus. This alliance is then joined by Antigonus the One-Eyed, another powerful satrap who flees to them after discovering Perdiccas' plan to have him executed on trumped-up charges. Consequence: this new, formidable coalition in the west makes a formal alliance with Ptolemy in the south, completely encircling Perdiccas. In the space of a few months, Perdiccas had managed to turn a one-on-one fight into a war against a supergroup of his most dangerous rivals. He now faced Ptolemy in Egypt, and the combined forces of Antipater, Craterus, and Antigonus in Macedonia and Anatolia. He had declared war on the world. This is a textbook case of how to snatch defeat from the jaws of victory before a single spear has been thrown. Perdiccas had the political finesse of a charging rhino, and he had just aimed himself at 3 brick walls at once. Even then, Perdiccas wasn't deterred. His confidence, or perhaps his arrogance, was boundless. He would fight them all and win. He made the fateful decision to divide his forces. He, with the main royal army and the 2 puppet kings, would continue with the original plan and invade Egypt. The problem of Europe, he decided, would be outsourced. He gave this suicide mission to the one man he trusted who was brilliant enough to possibly pull it off: Eumenes, the Greek secretary. Eumenes was tasked with defending Anatolia from the imminent invasion of Craterus and Antipater, 2 of the most legendary commanders of the age. It was a near impossible job, but Eumenes was loyal. The stage was now set. The flimsy piece of Babylon was shattered. Armies were on the move across the continent. In the south, Perdiccas marched toward the Nile, a man convinced of his own destiny, leading the world's best army to crush a rebellious subordinate. In the north, 2 legendary Macedonian generals were crossing the Hellespont into Asia, preparing to annihilate an upstart Greek administrator. The first war of the successors had begun, and Perdiccas had personally ensured it would be fought on the largest scale imaginable. While the storm clouds gathered over Anatolia, Perdiccas marched his grand army toward Egypt in the spring of 320 BC. He was the picture of imperial confidence. He had the kings, the elephants, and the veteran core of Alexander's own forces. He was the regent, the legitimate authority, on a mission to discipline a rogue subordinate. Ptolemy, in his estimation, was a clever but cautious commander with a smaller, less experienced army. This was supposed to be a formality, a quick, brutal lesson in obedience. And then he'd get back to the more amusing business of becoming a king. He had fundamentally misunderstood the man he was about to fight and the country he was about to invade. Ptolemy was not going to play by Perdiccas' rules. He knew he couldn't win a conventional, head-on battle in the open field. That would be suicide, so he turned Egypt itself into a weapon. The Nile, the lifeblood of the country, became his fortress wall. He reinforced every crossing point, dug new canals to create impassable moats, and garrisoned his forts with just enough men to hold back an army 10 times their size. When Perdiccas arrived at the eastern edge of the Nile Delta, near the fortress city of Pelusium, he didn't find an army waiting for him. He found an engineering nightmare. The first assault was a complete disaster. Perdiccas threw his forces at the river, trying to force a crossing, but Ptolemy's defenses were too strong. The riverbanks were too steep, the current too swift, and the defenders too well prepared. The mighty royal army was repulsed by mud, water, and a handful of well-positioned garrisons. It was embarrassing for an army that had crossed deserts and mountains to conquer the world. Being stopped cold by a river was a significant blow to their pride. For Perdiccas, a commander known for his harsh, unforgiving style, it was a personal humiliation. Furious, he marched his army south along the riverbank, searching for a weaker point. He found a ford and attempted another crossing, this time under the cover of darkness. For a moment, it looked like it might work, but Ptolemy was everywhere. He raced to the threatened sector with reinforcements and, as dawn broke, led a ferocious counterattack himself. The sources say Ptolemy fought on the ramparts like a common soldier, casting aside his general's cloak and inspiring his men with his own raw courage. Perdiccas's troops were once again thrown back. Across the river, having suffered heavy casualties, the region's aura of invincibility was starting to crack. His men were beginning to whisper, this wasn't the glorious conquest they had been promised. The breaking point came in a final, desperate gamble. Perdiccas decided to force a crossing directly opposite Egypt's capital, Memphis. He found what he believed to be an island in the Nile that could serve as a staging point. He ordered his men into the water. This time, however, the enemy wasn't Ptolemy's soldiers, but the Nile itself. The current was deceptively powerful. Men lost their footing and were swept away. Worse, the river was famously infested with crocodiles. As his elite Macedonian soldiers struggled in the water, they were dragged under by predators. It was a scene of pure horror. At least 2,000 of Perdiccas's best troops died, not in battle, but drowned or eaten, their bodies lost to the river. All because of their commander's arrogant miscalculation. That was it. The army's morale didn't just break, it shattered into a million pieces. They had followed Perdiccas out of respect for his position, not love. He was an aloof, severe, and increasingly unsuccessful leader. They had just watched their friends and comrades die a pointless, gruesome death. Their loyalty, already strained, evaporated completely. The chain reaction was swift and merciless. Cause Perdiccas's repeated, failed attempts to cross the Nile culminate in a catastrophic disaster where thousands of his own soldiers are killed by the river and its wildlife. Effect, the complete collapse of army morale turns simmering resentment for the arrogant Perdiccas into open hatred and mutiny. Consequence, 3 of his senior commanders, Ptolemy, Antigonus, and a rising officer named Seleucus, lead a conspiracy, storm the regent's tent in the middle of the night, and stab him to death. Just like that, it was over. The most powerful man in the world, the first heir to Alexander's imperial authority, wasn't killed in a heroic last stand or a climactic duel. He was murdered in his pajamas by his own insubordinate middle management. He was defeated by geography, superior engineering, and a handful of very hungry reptiles. It is a timeless lesson in leadership. If you lead your employees into a series of humiliating and deadly failures, don't be surprised when they arrange a late-night meeting to discuss your immediate and violent termination. The invasion of Egypt had ended in the most shocking way imaginable. The royal army, the great conquering machine, now sat leaderless in the middle of enemy territory, having just assassinated its own commander-in-chief. The man they had just killed was the enemy of the man on the other side of the river, Ptolemy. The situation had gone from merely disastrous to completely, irredeemably surreal. The scene on the banks of the Nile was one of the most surreal in ancient history. One day, the royal army was trying to kill Ptolemy. The next, Ptolemy was crossing the river with cartloads of food and water, acting less like a conqueror and more like a relief worker. He offered condolences for their dead, provisions for their empty stomachs, and friendship to the men who had just murdered his chief rival. It was a public relations masterstroke of breathtaking genius. He instantly transformed himself from the enemy into the benevolent savior. The Macedonian soldiers, who were starving, leaderless, and deep in hostile territory, were so overcome with gratitude that they offered to make him the new imperial regent on the spot. And in his second masterstroke of the week, Ptolemy politely refused. He was playing a different game than everyone else. He understood that the regency was a poison chalice. Being the man in charge just made you the man everyone wanted to kill. Why would he trade his secure, wealthy, self-contained kingdom in Egypt for a title that came with a dozen future assassins? No, thank you. He was happy right where he was. He gently deflected the offer, suggesting that 2 of the lead conspirators, Ptolemy and a commander named Aridaeus, could serve as temporary co-regents. He was putting the target on someone else's back while still looking magnanimous. It was right at this moment of confusion and backroom dealing that a messenger arrived from the northern front in Anatolia, bearing news that was an absolute bombshell. Eumenes, the Greek secretary left behind by Perdiccas to fight a hopeless holding action, had not only fought the invading army of Craterus and Antipater, but he had won. In a pitched battle, Eumenes' tactical brilliance had outmaneuvered the veteran Europeans, and in the chaos of the fighting, Craterus, the universally beloved, morally incorruptible Craterus, the Macedonian army's favorite son, had been killed. The reaction in the royal army's camp was volcanic. They were horrified. Craterus was a hero, a legend. Eumenes was a Greek, a pen pusher, an outsider they had always despised. The fact that this foreigner had just killed one of their greatest heroes was an unforgivable crime. Eumenes had won the battle, but in the court of Macedonian public opinion, he had just signed his own death warrant. The entire political landscape had been turned upside down. Perdiccas was dead, Craterus was dead, and the world needed a new boss. That boss would be Antipater, now the sole surviving commander of the European coalition. He marched his army down to Syria to meet with the now pacified royal army at a camp called Triparadisus. The victorious generals convened to pick up the pieces and redivide the world. This was the partition of Babylon 2.0, only this time the mood was far more toxic. The soldiers were angry, mutinous, and demanding the back pay Perdiccas had promised them. Antipater, the grumpy, no-nonsense old veteran, stared them down. He survived an attempted lynching, restored order through sheer force of will, and promptly had himself declared the new sole regent of the empire. With power secured, Antipater began shuffling the deck chairs on this very bloody, very sinking ship. The cause and effect chain was a direct response to the war's chaotic outcome. Cause: the death of both Perdiccas and Craterus creates a new power vacuum and leaves the Macedonian army enraged at Eumenes. Effect: the elder statesman Antipater leverages his seniority and the loyalty of the other commanders to seize the regency at the Triparadisus conference. Consequence: he issues a new imperial settlement that fundamentally reshapes the balance of power, rewarding the key players in the war against Perdiccas and setting the stage for the next round of conflict. The Triparadisus settlement was a ruthless piece of political score settling. First, Antipater announced he was taking the two kings, Philip III and Alexander IV, back to Macedon with him. The heart of the empire was officially moving back to Europe. Ptolemy was formally confirmed as the legitimate satrap of Egypt. His great gamble had paid off in full. The assassins of Perdiccas were rewarded for their treachery. Seleucus, for his leading role, was given the incredibly rich and strategic province of Babylon. This was his entry into the big leagues, but the biggest winner by far was Antigonus the One-Eyed. For his loyalty and crucial support, Antipater named him commander of the royal army in Asia and gave him a simple, terrifying task: hunt down and destroy Eumenes and any other Perdiccan loyalists still at large. This promotion effectively made Antigonus the supreme military power in all of Asia, with a massive army and a license to kill his rivals. In the meantime, Eumenes, the man who had actually won his battle, was formally condemned to death as a public enemy by the assembly of the Macedonian army. So after a world war, a regicide, and the death of a beloved hero, what had changed? They had swapped one region for another, shuffled some names on a map, and created a new military overlord in Asia who was even more powerful and ambitious than the last one. The partition of Triparadisus wasn't a solution. It was a reset button that just set up a new, even more dangerous game board. The world had a new org chart, and Antigonus the One-Eyed was the head of the Asian division with a single item on his to-do list: delete Eumenes. Antigonus had everything going for him. He had a massive army, the full legal authority of the new regent, Antipater, and the collective goodwill of every Macedonian who felt Eumenes, the Greek paper pusher, had gotten away with murder. Eumenes, by contrast, had nothing. His patron, Perdiccas, was dead. He had been officially declared a public enemy, and worst of all, his own Macedonian soldiers, the very men he had just led to a stunning victory, now looked at him with open contempt for having killed the heroic Craterus in that same battle. This is where the story of the Diadochi gets its most compelling underdog. Eumenes was not like the others. He wasn't a swaggering Macedonian aristocrat. He was Alexander's former secretary, a man of intellect and logistics, a master strategist who consistently found himself in impossible situations. And unlike the rest of the pack, who were transparently carving out kingdoms for themselves, Eumenes wrapped himself in the cloak of loyalty. He claimed he wasn't fighting for himself. He was fighting for the legitimate heirs, the disabled king and the boy king, who were now Antipater's captives back in Macedon. He was the last bastion of loyalty to Alexander's dynasty, the sole defender of the now hollow crown. This made him incredibly dangerous, because an ideologue is always more unpredictable than a simple warlord. The confrontation came quickly. Antigonus, commanding a force more than double the size of Eumenes's, marched into Cappadocia in 319 BC. Eumenes knew he couldn't win a straight fight, but Antigonus cornered him at a place called Ochinia. The battle that followed was a perfect microcosm of Eumenes' entire career. Tactical brilliance undone by personal betrayal. Eumenes' strategy was sound, his maneuvers clever, but at a critical moment, one of his cavalry officers, a Macedonian who couldn't stomach fighting for a Greek against other Macedonians, switched sides. The defection shattered his flank, and the battle turned into a rout. Eumenes lost thousands of men, but he himself managed a daring escape, slipping through Antigonus' grasp with a small band of around 600 loyal followers. What followed was a desperate chase across the Anatolian highlands. Antigonus was relentless, but Eumenes was slippery. He finally found refuge in a place that was less a fortress and more a glorified rock. Nora, a tiny, unassailable outpost perched on a cliff. Antigonus' massive army arrived to find their quarry holed up in a place they could surround, but never assault. The great manhunt had turned into a static siege. Antigonus, ever the pragmatist, offered Eumenes a parley. He figured the condemned man, trapped and with no hope of rescue, would be eager to negotiate a surrender. He was wrong. When invited to come down, Eumenes shouted from the ramparts one of the most defiant messages of the age. He declared that Eumenes, would not negotiate with anyone as an inferior. He was a loyal satrap of the kings, not a condemned fugitive. He would only speak to Antigonus as an equal or not at all. It was an act of supreme, almost suicidal, arrogance, and Antigonus was secretly impressed. After a brief, fruitless meeting, where Eumenes refused to swear an oath of loyalty to Antigonus personally, the siege began in earnest. This is the chain of events that define this next phase. Cause. Antigonus, armed with imperial authority, is tasked with destroying the fugitive Eumenes. Effect. He defeats Eumenes in battle through betrayal and superior numbers. But Eumenes escapes to the impregnable fortress of Nora, where he defiantly resists. Consequence. The resulting siege of Nora ties up Antigonus' attention, elevates Eumenes to a symbol of principled resistance, and showcases the debilitating ethnic prejudice that would forever undermine the Greek generals' command. Life inside Nora was a testament to Eumenes' nerdy ingenuity. The space was so cramped there was barely room for his men and their horses. To keep them all from going mad with inactivity, he devised a rigorous training schedule. He turned the largest room in the fort, barely 20 feet square, into a gymnasium. And for the horses, he invented a bizarre but effective system. They were suspended from the ceiling by harnesses, their hooves just off the ground, so they could be fed and then forced to kick and struggle, simulating exercise. It was weird, it was meticulous, and it worked. For over a year, Eumenes and his small band held out, a tiny island of defiance against the might of Asia. The whole situation was tragically ironic. The one man fighting for the correct cause, the preservation of Alexander's dynasty, was a Greek intellectual so thoroughly despised by the Macedonians that his own officers would rather betray him than follow him. It was like being the most brilliant surgeon in the world, but having a crippling fear of blood. No matter how competent Eumenes was, he could never escape the fatal flaw of his own birth. He was trapped on that rock, his cause seeming utterly hopeless, waiting for a miracle or a death sentence. For over a year, Eumenes held out in his rocky prison, a forgotten man in a world that had moved on. The great Antigonus, leaving a subordinate to maintain the boring siege, was busy consolidating his power. It seemed that this was the new status quo. Eumenes would eventually starve, Antigonus would rule Asia, and the empire would groan along under the steady hand of the old regent Antipater back in Macedon. And then, in 319 BC, a single death notice arrived from Europe and set the entire world on fire again. Antipater was dead. The old regent, nearly 80 years old, had finally succumbed to age, but it was his last will and testament that proved to be his most catastrophic legacy. In a decision of such spectacular stupidity it defies all rational explanation, Antipater chose his successor. He looked at his own son, Cassander, a ruthless, ambitious, and perfectly capable commander, and said, nah. Instead, he passed the regency to Polyperchon, an aging, unremarkable general whose main qualification seemed to be that he was old. It was the ancient equivalent of a retiring CEO handing the company over to a random middle manager from the 1980s instead of his own hyper-competent son. The result was immediate and predictable chaos. Cassander was enraged. The other Diadochi were bewildered. Nobody respected Polyperchon, the central authority of the empire, which had been tenuously held together by Antipater's immense personal prestige, dissolved overnight. And thousands of miles away in Anatolia, a light bulb went on over Antigonus's one good eye. The leash was off. Antipater had been his superior, a man to be respected and obeyed. Polyperchon was a joke. With the empire's center collapsing into a new civil war between Polyperchon and the furious Cassander, Antigonus realized there was no one left to tell him what to do. He was the man with the biggest army in Asia. It was time to go big. While the new regent was fumbling to assert his non-existent authority, Antigonus went on a rampage. He simply stopped pretending he was a subordinate. He was the new power in the world, and he started acting like it. He systematically dismantled any opposition in Anatolia and Syria. He marched on the satrapy of Lydia, kicked out its governor, and installed his own man. He did the same in Hellespontine Phrygia. He wasn't just a general anymore, he was a king in all but name, absorbing the armies of his rivals and swelling his own forces to an unstoppable size. His ambition was boundless, and his methods were brutally efficient. His masterstroke was a lightning campaign east to Susa, one of the ancient capitals of Persia. There, in the city's vaults, lay a significant portion of the imperial treasury Alexander had captured. Antigonus seized it all, a truly staggering 25,000 talents. To put that in perspective, this was enough money to hire and pay for a massive army for several years. Without needing to tax a single citizen, he now had the largest army and the largest bank account on the continent. This is the moment Antigonus transformed. Cause, the respected regent Antipater dies, naming a weak successor, Polyperchon, which immediately triggers a new civil war in the empire's heartland. Effect, the power vacuum in Macedon allows Antigonus, the general of Asia, to ignore the new regent's authority and embark on a massive campaign of conquest, seizing control of Anatolia and the imperial treasuries. Consequence, Antigonus becomes a self-sufficient, continent-spanning superpower, forcing the desperate Polyperchon to seek a radical countermeasure, pardoning the besieged Eumenes, and appointing him as the new general of Asia to fight Antigonus. Antigonus wasn't just a player in the game anymore, he was the game. He understood the new reality. Titles and legitimacy were nice, but spears and silver were what truly mattered. While everyone else was caught up in the squabbles in Greece, he was quietly, or rather very loudly, swallowing a continent. And this brings us back to the man on the rock. Eumenes' situation had seemed hopeless, but the chaos that had unleashed Antigonus also became his salvation. Polyperchon, the weak new regent, was losing his war against Cassander. He needed allies. Desperately, he looked across the map and saw a brilliant general, already a sworn enemy of Antigonus, conveniently trapped in a fortress. In a stunning reversal of policy, Polyperchon issued a royal decree. He officially pardoned Eumenes, he restored all his titles, and then he named him the new general of Asia, commanding him, in the name of the kings, to raise an army and destroy the traitor Antigonus. A messenger bearing this royal decree managed to slip through the siege lines at Nora. And so, one day, Eumenes woke up a condemned fugitive and went to bed as the legitimate commander of the royal forces in Asia, with a royal commission to kill the very man who was holding him prisoner. The board had been flipped, and the weirdest comeback story of the ancient world was about to begin. Armed with a royal pardon and a fancy new title, Eumenes walked out of the fortress of Nora a free man. He had gone from fugitive to supreme commander overnight, a promotion that came with a crown-stamped IOU for an army and a mission to do the impossible. Antigonus, furious at being outplayed diplomatically, now had a real war on his hands. Eumenes, the ghost he thought he had trapped, was loose again. And this time, he had the full, if flimsy, backing of the empire. A general without an army is just a man with a fancy hat, so Eumenes' first job was recruitment. He headed east, deeper into Asia, beyond Antigonus' immediate grasp. There, he presented his credentials to the satraps of the upper provinces Persia, Media, Babylonia. These were powerful men who were deeply suspicious of Antigonus' meteoric rise. They saw him as a threat to their own autonomy, so when Eumenes arrived as the legitimate, royally appointed general, they grudgingly fell in line. His greatest prize, however, was securing the allegiance of the Argiraspides, the Silver Shields. This was a unit of 3,000 infantrymen who were, without exaggeration, living legends. They were the hardened veterans of Philip II and Alexander's campaigns. Men who had fought from the fields of Macedon to the plains of India. They were all in their 60s and 70s. But they were universally considered the most skilled and fearsome soldiers on the planet. They were also notoriously arrogant, insubordinate, and greedy. They agreed to fight for Eumenes because he carried the king's authority and, more importantly, controlled the king's payroll. But they never respected him. To them, he was just a Greek bookkeeper who was temporarily signing their checks. With this fractious but formidable coalition, Eumenes waged a brilliant 2-year campaign against Antigonus across the vast landscapes of modern-day Iran and Iraq. He was consistently outnumbered and perpetually undermined by his jealous Macedonian subordinates. But his strategic genius was undeniable. He led Antigonus on a grueling chase, fighting and winning a series of smaller engagements and one major pitched battle at Paratakene, which ended as a bloody draw. That left Eumenes in control of the field. He was consistently doing the impossible, holding together a divided army and outthinking the most powerful warlord in the world. The final showdown came in the winter of 316 BC at the Battle of Gabin. The two exhausted armies met in a dusty, windswept plain for one last roll of the dice. As the battle began, It was clear that Eumenes' tactical plan was superior, and at the heart of his line, the Silver Shields did what they always did. The old men, fighting with the skill and fury of demons, crashed into Antigonus' infantry and shattered it completely. They were an unstoppable force. A silver tide of destruction, it looked. For all the world, like Eumenes was about to cap his incredible comeback with a decisive, war-winning victory. But Antigonus had one last trick up his sleeve. While the Silver Shields were busy carving up his center, he noticed that their own camp, their baggage train, was now undefended. This baggage train wasn't just spare equipment, it was the repository of their entire lives. It held the loot of 30 years of conquest, their gold, their silver, their families, and their servants. It was everything they owned. Antigonus dispatched a unit of fast-moving cavalry on a wide flanking maneuver. They bypassed the main battle entirely and fell upon the baggage train, capturing the whole thing without a fight. The battle itself ended inconclusively as night fell. But Antigonus now held the ultimate weapon. He sent a message to the camp of the Silver Shields. The offer was simple and brutal. I have your families. I have your life savings. Give me Eumenes, and you get it all back. This was the moment of truth for the greatest soldiers in the world. Cause during the Battle of Gabine, Antigonus' cavalry captures the baggage train containing the entire accumulated wealth and families of the Silver Shields. Effect, faced with a choice between loyalty to the general who had just led them to victory and the recovery of their entire worldly possessions, the veteran soldiers choose their possessions. Consequence, in one of the most cynical acts of betrayal in military history, the Silver Shields mutiny arrest Eumenes and hand him over in chains to Antigonus, effectively ending the war and sealing the fate of the royal family's last best defender. Antigonus reportedly agonized over what to do with his rival, for whom he had a grudging respect, but his commanders convinced him that Eumenes was too brilliant and too popular with the non-Macedonian troops to be left alive. After a few days, Eumenes was executed. The most brilliant general of the age, the man who outfought and outthought everyone, wasn't defeated on the battlefield. He was defeated by a moving company. The legends of the Silver Shields traded their commander's life for their furniture and coin collection, a pathetic end to a heroic struggle. With Eumenes gone, all of Asia now belonged to Antigonus. With Eumenes dead, Antigonus the One-Eyed was the undisputed king of the East. He had crushed all opposition and now controlled a territory stretching from the Mediterranean to the borders of India. But while he had been busy playing continental Pac-Man, the other half of the world had been consumed by its own chaotic civil war. The death of the regent Antipater and his boneheaded succession plan had plunged Macedon and Greece into a violent tailspin. On one side was Polyperchon, the legitimate but feeble new regent. On the other was Cassander, Antipater's son, a man boiling with resentment and ambition. Polyperchon, knowing he lacked the prestige to command obedience, tried a classic political gambit. He pandered. He issued a decree declaring the liberty of the Greeks. He promised to restore the democracies in cities like Athens and to withdraw the Macedonian garrisons that Cassander's father had installed. This wasn't some noble gesture of political freedom. It was a cynical attempt to start a fire in his enemy's backyard. He was trying to win a war by turning the local population against his rival. It was a messy, chaotic strategy, and it only half worked, plunging Greece into a series of confused local conflicts. The main event, however, was the fight for Macedon itself. Cassander, proving himself to be a far more capable commander than Polyperchon, quickly gained the upper hand. He secured the allegiance of the Macedonian forces in Greece and, with naval help from Antigonus, blockaded Athens, eventually forcing the city to surrender to him. Polyperchon's authority was crumbling, and that's when a far more terrifying player entered the game, Olympias, the mother of Alexander the Great, living in exile in Epirus. Olympias had been watching the chaos with keen interest. She was a woman of ferocious ambition and bottomless grudges, and she saw Polyperchon's failure as her opportunity. With the regent's blessing, she raised an army and invaded Macedon in 317 BC, not just as an ally, but as the champion of her grandson, the 7-year-old King Alexander IV. She was coming to claim the kingdom for the true bloodline. The defending Macedonian army was technically loyal to the other king, the disabled Philip III, whose ambitious wife Eurydice was trying to act as his regent. But when the soldiers on the front line saw Olympias, the mother of their god King Alexander, they laid down their arms and defected to her. En masse, Philip III and Eurydice were captured without a fight. Once in power, Olympias did not show mercy. She unleashed a reign of terror. She had King Philip III, her own stepson, executed. She then presented Eurydice with a sword, a rope, and a cup of hemlock, forcing her to commit suicide. But she didn't stop there. Believing that cruelty was the best way to secure power, she systematically purged anyone she suspected of loyalty to Cassander, slaughtering over 100 prominent Macedonians. It was a short-sighted, brutal revenge spree that completely backfired. The Macedonian aristocracy, who craved stability above all else, was horrified. This was the opening Cassander needed. Cause: the failing regent Polyperchon allies with Alexander's mother Olympias, who invades Macedon to secure the throne for her grandson. Effect: Olympias captures and executes the co-king Philip III and launches a bloody purge of her enemies, which horrifies and alienates the Macedonian establishment. Consequence: Cassander exploits the backlash against her cruelty, racing north to defeat and execute Olympias, thereby seizing control of Macedon and taking the boy king Alexander IV and his mother Roxana hostage, while Olympias was busy with her executions. Cassander made a lightning march north. The support for Olympias evaporated as quickly as it had appeared. He trapped her and the royal court in the city of Pydna and settled in for a long winter siege. By the spring of 316 BC, the city was starving, and Olympias was forced to surrender. Cassander promised to spare her life, a promise he had no intention of keeping. He had her condemned by the army and executed by the relatives of her victims. With her death, the war for Europe was over. Cassander stood victorious. Polyperchon was a fugitive. And most importantly, Cassander now had possession of the most important political assets in the world, the young king Alexander and his mother, Roxana. He placed them under guard effectively. Under house arrest in the fortress of Amphipolis. He was now the undisputed master of Macedon, the lord of Greece, and the jailer of the Argead dynasty. He had played the game perfectly, waiting for his incompetent and overly emotional rivals to self-destruct before stepping over their corpses to claim the prize. The board was now set with two titans, Antigonus, the master of Asia, and Cassander, the master of Europe. It was only a matter of time before they turned on each other. Antigonus the One-Eyed was the king of the world, and he knew it. After the execution of Eumenes, he stood astride the continent of Asia like a colossus. He commanded the largest, most experienced army on the planet. He controlled the vast imperial treasuries. He had crushed every rival in his path. Now, in 315 BC, he marched his forces west, not just as a general, but as an overlord coming to collect his dues. And his first stop was Babylon, the rich province ruled by Seleucus. Seleucus had been an ally in the wars against Perdiccas and Eumenes. He probably expected a friendly visit, a slap on the back from his powerful patron. What he got was an audit from hell. Antigonus strode into his capital and, with the casual arrogance of a new CEO visiting a branch office, demanded that Seleucus provide a full accounting of the province's revenues. This was not a request between equals. This was a clear message. You work for me now. Seleucus was a brilliant and ambitious man in his own right, and he understood instantly what was happening. He wasn't a partner anymore. He was a subordinate, and a temporary one at that. He knew that the moment he submitted his reports, he'd be removed from his post. And if he was lucky, he'd only be imprisoned. So Seleucus did the only sensible thing a man in his position could do. He ran. With a tiny escort of just 50 horsemen, he fled Babylon by night, embarking on a desperate dash across hundreds of miles of desert. His destination, Egypt. He was a man without a province, a general without an army, but he possessed the one thing that could harm Antigonus more than any weapon: the truth. This was Antigonus's first great blunder. In his hubris, he had underestimated his rival and allowed the one man who understood his grand ambitions to escape and sound the alarm. Seleucus arrived at Ptolemy's court in Alexandria, a fugitive bearing a terrifying message. He laid it all out for the cautious master of Egypt. Antigonus isn't just consolidating power, he warned. He's aiming for the whole thing. Alexander's empire. He has the men, he has the money, and he has an ego the size of a mountain. He will not stop until he has crushed all of us. He'll pick us off one by one, using the vast resources of Asia to fund his conquests. Ptolemy, the ultimate long-game player, had been watching Antigonus's rise with growing anxiety. Seleucus's frantic testimony confirmed his worst fears. The time for cautious observation was over. It was time to build an alliance. Ptolemy became the diplomatic heart of a new global coalition. He sent emissaries to the other two remaining major players: Cassander, the new master of Macedon, and Lysimachus, the tough ruler of Thrace. The message was stark and simple: unite or die. This is how the Third War of the Diadochi was born. Cause: a triumphant and arrogant Antigonus attempts to subordinate his supposed ally Seleucus, treating him like a mere employee. Effect: Seleucus flees to Egypt and successfully convinces Ptolemy. Cassander and Lysimachus that Antigonus is a threat to all of their existences, prompting them to form a grand anti-Antigonus coalition. Consequence, the coalition issues an impossible ultimatum to Antigonus, demanding he dismantle his own empire. His scornful rejection of these terms officially ignites a new world war. The Allies' ultimatum was a masterpiece of political maneuvering, a list of demands so outrageous they were designed to be rejected. They demanded that Antigonus share the tens of thousands of talents he decaptured from the imperial treasuries. They demanded that he restore Seleucus to his rightful place in Babylon. They demanded he hand over vast territories in Syria and Anatolia to them. They were, in essence, telling him to peacefully surrender the empire he had just single-handedly conquered. Antigonus, sitting in his camp, received their message and likely laughed. Who were these petty regional lords to tell him, the master of Asia, what to do? He had more soldiers, more money, and more power than all three of them combined. He contemptuously dismissed their demands and started preparing for war. His biggest mistake was getting this good. He had become so overwhelmingly successful that he had frightened all the other major predators into a single, desperate pack. It's the final boss problem. Once you've methodically eliminated all the other contenders for power, the ones that are left have no choice but to team up against you for the final level. Antigonus the One-Eyed had become the raid boss of the Hellenistic world, and everyone else had just formed a guild to try and take him down. The battle lines were drawn. It was Antigonus versus the world. The Third War of the Diadochi kicked off in 314 BC, and it was a sprawling, multi-front mess. Antigonus, holding the central position in his Anatolian fortress, was fighting a war against the entire perimeter of his empire. In the west, his armies clashed with Cassander's forces in Greece. In the north, they skirmished with Lysimachus in Thrace. And in the south, they began a long, grinding war with Ptolemy for control of Syria and the Phoenician coast. Antigonus knew that to win, he needed a navy powerful enough to challenge his rivals on the sea. So his first major objective was to capture the coastal cities of Tyre and Sidon with their legendary shipyards. But Antigonus wasn't just fighting with spears, he was fighting with words. In a brilliant, if breathtakingly hypocritical, PR move, he held a grand assembly at his camp in Tyre. There, he declared that Cassander was an outlaw and a murderer for killing Olympias, and for holding the young King Alexander IV and his mother Roxana as prisoners. Then, with a straight face, Antigonus the absolute monarch proclaimed himself the champion of Greek freedom, demanding that all Greek cities be liberated from Macedonian garrisons. It was a declaration of war not just on Cassander, but on his entire political system. And it was designed to win hearts and minds across the Aegean. For a few years, the war was a brutal stalemate. Antigonus was too strong to be defeated, but his enemies were too widespread to be crushed all at once. The balance of power seemed frozen. But then, in 312 BC, Ptolemy decided to make a move. Antigonus himself was busy campaigning in the north, leaving his charismatic, reckless, and very young son, Demetrius, in command of the army in Syria. Ptolemy saw an opportunity for a decisive blow. He gathered his army and marched out of Egypt. And he brought with him his most valuable houseguest, the exiled satrap of Babylon, Seleucus. Seleucus had spent years in Ptolemy's court, a king in waiting, a general advising on strategy. He convinced Ptolemy to approve one of the most audacious plans of the entire era. The plan was this: if Ptolemy could smash Demetrius's army in a pitched battle, the resulting chaos would create a window of opportunity. In that window, Ptolemy was to give Seleucus a tiny, token force. With that force, Seleucus would attempt a mad dash across the desert to reclaim his lost province of Babylon. It was a long shot, a plan so risky it bordered on suicidal. But Ptolemy, a calculated gambler, agreed. First, they had to win the battle at Gaza. Near the Egyptian border, Ptolemy's veteran army, with Seleucus commanding a wing, met the flamboyant forces of the young Demetrius. The result was a catastrophe for the Antigonids. Ptolemy's experience and discipline completely outclassed Demetrius's youthful arrogance. The Antigonid army was shattered, their camp captured, and Demetrius himself was sent fleeing back to his father in disgrace. The door to the east was wide open. This is where the legend of Seleucus begins. Cause: Ptolemy and Seleucus inflict a crushing defeat on Antigonus' son Demetrius at the Battle of Gaza, creating a temporary power vacuum in the eastern part of Antigonus' empire. Effect: Ptolemy honors his promise and gives the exiled Seleucus a minuscule army of about 1,000 men to attempt the seemingly impossible task of reconquering his former province. Consequence: capitalizing on the goodwill he had cultivated during his previous rule, Seleucus marches into Babylonia, where the local population and garrisons defect to him, allowing him to recapture the entire province almost bloodlessly and establish a hostile new power base deep within Antigonus' territory. Immediately after the victory at Gaza, Ptolemy gave Seleucus around 800 infantry and 200 cavalry. With this comically small army, Seleucus set off to reconquer a territory the size of a modern country. As he marched into Mesopotamia, something amazing happened. The people remembered him. Unlike the harsh governor Antigonus had installed, Seleucus had been a popular and just ruler. His reputation had preceded him. When he reached the capital, Babylon, the citizens rose up and threw open the gates. The local garrisons, his former soldiers, swarmed to his banner. He didn't have to reconquer his province. It welcomed him home with open arms. It was a moment straight out of an epic poem. The comeback kid, the exiled hero, returning against all odds to reclaim his throne, not with overwhelming force, but with the loyalty of his people. In one brilliant, daring stroke, Seleucus had gone from a landless fugitive to the master of one of the richest regions on earth. And more importantly, he had just plunged a dagger deep into the soft underbelly of Antigonus' empire. The war had a new front, and a new king had just entered the game. To understand the disaster at Gaza, you first have to understand the man who led the losing side. Demetrius was something new on the world stage. The other Diadochi, Ptolemy, Cassander, Antigonus himself were all Alexander's contemporaries. They were grizzled, pragmatic, middle-aged men who had clawed their way to power. Demetrius was Generation 2. He was young, impossibly handsome, and dripping with a theatrical charisma the old guard could never hope to match. He was less a Macedonian general and more a glam rock warlord. He loved spectacle, luxury, and grand, dramatic gestures. He approached warfare like a performance, always seeking the most glorious and memorable victory. And in 312 BC, his father, Antigonus, handed him the starring role in the defense of Syria. He faced two of the craftiest veterans of the age. On the other side of the field at Gaza stood Ptolemy, the cautious master of defense, and Seleucus, the determined and cunning exile. They were older, wiser, and had learned their trade at the feet of Alexander himself. They commanded a smaller army, but it was disciplined and led by men who valued survival over style. Demetrius, by contrast, had a larger force, superior cavalry, and his prized weapon, a fearsome contingent of Indian war elephants. He was supremely confident. This was his debut, his chance to prove to the world and to his father that he was a conqueror in his own right. He saw Ptolemy as a timid old fox who wouldn't dare leave his hole, and he was ready to deliver a show-stopping performance. His plan was a reflection of his personality, a big, loud, head-on assault. It was classic Macedonian doctrine, the kind of thing Alexander himself might have done. He would use his superior numbers in cavalry to overwhelm Ptolemy's right flank, while his elephants, the living tanks of the ancient world, would charge and shatter the enemy's main infantry line. It was a plan based on brute force and the psychological terror inspired by his war beasts. He expected Ptolemy's army to simply disintegrate, but Ptolemy and Seleucus were not idiots. They had studied their opponent. They knew Demetrius was young, arrogant, and in love with his elephants. They didn't prepare for a battle. They prepared for an elephant charge. In front of their main line, they constructed a formidable defensive barrier. They hammered thousands of sharp, iron caltrops, vicious, multi-pronged spikes designed to cripple man and beast into the ground and chain them together to create a primitive minefield. Behind this barrier, they stationed their best anti-elephant troops, skirmishers with javelins and archers, tasked with one job: panicking the animals. The battle began, and Demetrius, right on cue, sent his elephants lumbering forward. It was supposed to be a terrifying, line-breaking charge. Instead, it was a catastrophe. Cause: the inexperienced and overconfident Demetrius bases his entire strategy at Gaza on a massive frontal assault with his war elephants. Effect: the veteran commanders Ptolemy and Seleucus anticipate this exact move and prepare a devastatingly effective trap of chained caltrops and missile troops, which wounds the elephants and causes them to panic. Consequence: the panicked elephants turn and rampage back through Demetrius' own ranks, sowing chaos and disorder, which allows Ptolemy and Seleucus to launch a counterattack that completely routs the Antigonid army, leading directly to Seleucus' recapture of Babylon. The scene was one of pure chaos. The lead elephants hit the caltrop field and were immediately lamed, trumpeting in agony. Javelins and arrows rained down, killing their riders and peppering their hides. An elephant in pain is an uncontrollable engine of destruction. The terrified beasts turned around and crashed back into their own cavalry and infantry, trampling soldiers and shattering formations. Demetrius' ultimate weapon had just dismantled his own army. Seeing the enemy in total disarray, Ptolemy and Seleucus ordered the advance. The battle quickly turned into a rout. Demetrius was forced to flee for his life, leaving behind thousands of dead, thousands more captured, and his entire camp, which included his luxurious personal tent and a massive amount of treasure. Most humiliating of all, he lost all his elephants. It was a total, unmitigated disaster. A lesson in how youthful exuberance is no match for old age treachery. This crushing defeat, the first great public failure of the glam rock warlord, was the single event that opened the door for Seleucus to make his triumphant return to Babylon, forever changing the map of the world. The loss at Gaza and the sudden reappearance of Seleucus in Babylon was a strategic gut punch for Antigonus. For the first time in years, his grand campaign to reunite the empire was not just stalled, it was rolling backward. While his son Demetrius, to his credit, did manage to score a minor tactical victory against the Ptolemaic general shortly after Gaza, it wasn't enough to change the bigger picture. Antigonus was still the most powerful man in the world, but he was also a man fighting a for-front war, with one of those fronts now burning brightly in his own backyard. He was a pragmatist. He knew he couldn't fight everyone, everywhere, all at once. He needed to shrink the war. He needed a pause. As it turned out, his enemies were feeling the strain, too. The war had been raging for years, draining their treasuries and bleeding their armies. Ptolemy had Syria, but holding it was costly. Cassander was still struggling to pacify all of Greece. Lysimachus just wanted to be left alone to finish beating up Thracians. They were all tired. And so, in 311 BC, the great warlords decided to do something completely out of character. They talked. What emerged was a document known as the Peace of the Dinas, which stands as one of the most cynical and dishonest treaties in history. The terms were, on the surface, a recognition of reality. Cassander was acknowledged as the ruler of Macedon and general of Europe. Lysimachus was confirmed in Thrace. Ptolemy was confirmed in Egypt. And Antigonus was recognized as the ruler of all of Asia. They all solemnly swore, for the 100th time, that the Greek cities would be free. It was a neat and tidy map that locked in everyone's gains. But the real meaning was in who they left out. Seleucus, their supposed ally who had just risked everything to reclaim Babylon, was not mentioned. By naming Antigonus ruler of all of Asia, the other three Dinas had just sold Seleucus down the river, officially sanctioning Antigonus's coming war to destroy him. Then there was the most sinister clause of all. The treaty stated that Cassander's authority in Europe would last until King Alexander IV came of age. The young king was now 12 years old. This little phrase was not a promise of future restoration. It was a death sentence. It put a formal expiration date on the current power structure. It acknowledged that the moment the boy became a man, he would become a legitimate threat to all of them by putting it in writing. They were all implicitly agreeing that the boy could never be allowed to reach that age. This whole process was a masterclass in bad faith diplomacy. Cause years of mutually exhausting warfare lead the main Diadochi to seek a temporary ceasefire, to consolidate their gains and recover their strength. Effect, they signed the Peace of the Dinas in 311 BC, a cynical treaty that formally recognizes their respective territories, but pointedly excludes Seleucus and sets a dangerous timeline on the life of the boy king, Alexander IV. Consequence, this sham peace serves only as a temporary convenience, allowing Antigonus to immediately pivot his entire military might against the isolated Seleucus, while giving Cassander the political cover he needs to eliminate the royal heir. Calling this a peace treaty is like calling a shark-feeding frenzy a collaborative dining experience. It was a brief, mutually agreed upon pause for everyone to reload. Antigonus didn't want peace. He wanted a free hand to crush Seleucus without Ptolemy attacking his flank. Ptolemy and Cassander didn't want peace. They wanted time to rebuild their armies and solidify their borders. The entire document was written in disappearing ink, a flimsy excuse for the next, even more brutal phase of the conflict. The handshakes were barely over before the generals were back in their tents, drawing up plans for the wars that this peace was designed to enable. Two immediate acts of violence would follow: a full-scale invasion of Babylon and a quiet, cold-blooded murder in a Macedonian fortress. The Peace of the Dinas had established a fragile, temporary truce in the West, but it had also started a ticking clock. That clock was the life of a 13-year-old boy, King Alexander IV. The treaty's most important clause, that Cassander's rule in Macedon would end when the king came of age, was meant to placate traditionalists, but what it really did was make the king's survival a political impossibility for Cassander. The boy was no longer a convenient puppet but a rapidly maturing threat. Every day he got older, the calls for him to take his rightful throne grew louder. factions loyal to the Argead dynasty were beginning to stir, whispering that it was time for the regency to end. The living symbol of the empire was about to become a rallying point for all of Cassander's enemies. And the man in charge of the king's fate was a man who harbored a deep and venomous hatred for Hai's entire family. Cassander's father, Antipater, may have been a loyal servant to the Argead dynasty, but Cassander despised Alexander the Great's memory. He was the one who had hunted down and executed Alexander's mother, Olympias. He saw the royal family not as a sacred trust, but as a venomous snake he was forced to hold. For him, this wasn't just a political problem, it was personal. He was not going to let the son of the man he hated grow up to depose him. The peace treaty gave him the perfect cover. With the other dynasts distracted by their own affairs and the world technically at rest, Cassander decided to solve his king problem permanently. There was no public trial, no dramatic announcement, no legal pretext. There was only a cold, quiet, secret order. In 310 or 309 BC, inside the fortress of Amphipolis, where they were held as honored prisoners, the 13-year-old Alexander IV and his mother, the Bactrian princess Roxana, were murdered by their guards. Their bodies were buried in secret, unmarked graves, and for a time, Cassander pretended they were still alive. But the truth eventually trickled out. This was not just another political murder in an era already drenched in blood. This was a world-changing event. Cause, the peace of the dynasts explicitly makes the young king Alexander IV a political threat to Cassander's rule upon reaching adulthood. Effect, to secure his own power and eliminate the rallying point for his opposition, Cassander secretly orders the assassination of both the teenage king and his mother, Roxana. Consequence, this act permanently extinguishes the direct bloodline of Alexander the Great, shatters the last symbol of imperial unity, and destroys the legal fiction that the Diadochi are merely regents, forcing them to confront the reality that the throne is now empty forever. For 13 years, the entire brutal, chaotic enterprise had operated under a thin veneer of legitimacy. The generals were satraps, the leaders were regents, and every decree, every war, every tax was levied in the name of the kings. The disabled Philip III and the boy Alexander IV were the legal and spiritual center of the empire. Even as puppets, they were the excuse. They were the reason the whole thing hadn't officially dissolved into a collection of independent states. With this one squalid assassination in a provincial fortress, Cassander had murdered the excuse. The throne of Alexander the Great was now well and truly empty. The Argead dynasty, which had ruled Macedon for centuries and produced the greatest conqueror the world had ever known, was extinct. The dream of a single, unified empire died with that boy. For over a decade, the Diadochi had been pretending to be the caretakers of Alexander's legacy. Cassander's brutal act of house cleaning finally forced everyone to admit the truth. They weren't caretakers, they were the demolition crew, and they had just brought down the last supporting pillar of the entire structure. There was no one left to serve. The only path left was to rule. The secret murder of Alexander IV and Roxana created a strange and silent void at the center of the world. For the first time in centuries, there was no Argead on the throne of Macedon. The generals were now ruling in their own right, but they were still just generals. They were warlords, satraps, dynasts, but not kings. To take the title of Basileus, king, was to claim the station of Alexander himself. It was the last and greatest taboo. For several years after the boy's death, an uneasy quiet lay over this issue. The Diadochi continued their endless wars, but no one dared to put on the crown. It would take an ego as large as Antigonus's, fueled by a victory so spectacular it seemed to shake the heavens, to finally break the seal. The catalyst came in 306 BC, not on land, but on the sea. The peace of 311 was a distant memory, and Antigonus was once again locked in a massive war with Ptolemy. The prize was the strategic island of Cyprus. Antigonus sent his son, Demetrius, now a seasoned and brilliant commander, with a massive fleet and army to conquer the island. Ptolemy, unable to let such a valuable possession fall, gathered his own formidable navy and sailed from Egypt to confront him. The two fleets, representing the two greatest naval powers in the eastern Mediterranean, met off the coast of the city of Salamis. The battle was Demetrius's masterpiece. He was no longer the arrogant amateur of Gaza. He was an innovator and a master of naval tactics. In a ferocious, day-long battle, he completely outgeneraled Ptolemy. The result was not just a victory, it was an annihilation. Ptolemy's fleet was obliterated. Demetrius sank or captured the vast majority of his ships, seized his entire army, and even took his campaign treasury. Ptolemy himself was forced to flee back to Egypt in humiliation with just 8 ships. a fraction of the great armada he had sailed with, a messenger was dispatched to carry the news to the elder Antigonus. When he arrived, he theatrically proclaimed, "Hail, King Antigonus!" The old man, now over 80, was overcome with joy. This victory felt like the final, decisive blow. Ptolemy was crippled, his naval power shattered, the path to Egypt itself and the reunification of Alexander's empire seemed wide open. In this moment of supreme triumph, his army and his commanders gathered around him and, with a single voice, acclaimed him king. One of his followers stepped forward and placed a diadem, the simple ribbon symbolizing royalty, upon his head. Antigonus accepted. At long last, a successor had claimed the ultimate prize. He then sent a second diadem to his son in Cyprus, addressing the letter to King Demetrius. This single act sent a shockwave across the world. Cause: Demetrius wins an overwhelming and decisive naval victory against Ptolemy at the Battle of Salamis, which is perceived as proof of Antigonid's supremacy. Effect: in a surge of triumph and popular acclamation, Antigonus and Demetrius become the first of the successors to formally adopt the title of king. Basilius. Consequence: this bold move forces the other Diadochi to follow suit out of political necessity. In a rapid domino effect, Ptolemy, Seleucus, Cassander, and Lysimachus all declare themselves kings to avoid appearing as second-class rulers, officially fracturing the single empire into 5 rival Hellenistic kingdoms. The news reached Egypt, where Ptolemy was still reeling from his defeat. He couldn't let Antigonus hold a superior title. If Antigonus was a king, then he had to be a king, too. So he had his own army and court to claim him as such. It was a reactionary move, but a necessary one. Then the news traveled to Babylon, where Seleucus, still fighting his own brutal war against Antigonus's forces, also took the title of king. Then Cassander in Macedon and finally Lysimachus in Thrace did the same. It was the ancient world's most consequential act of peer pressure. Antigonus had declared himself CEO of the world, so all the other regional vice presidents had to immediately promote themselves to CEO of their own divisions just to maintain their status. The fiction of the unified empire was officially over. The world was now ruled by 5 kings, each claiming to be the heir to Alexander, and each viewing the other 4 as illegitimate pretenders to be destroyed. The final, winner-take-all phase of the wars was about to begin. Crowned as kings and fresh from a world-shaking victory, Antigonus and Demetrius decided it was time to end the game once and for all. Their target was Ptolemy. In late 306 BC, they launched a massive, coordinated invasion of Egypt, the grandest military operation since Alexander's day. Antigonus marched from Syria with an army of nearly 90,000 men, while Demetrius commanded a colossal fleet meant to support the land invasion and force a landing. This was it. This was the final push to eliminate their craftiest rival and reunite the wealthiest corner of the old empire, and it was a complete, total, and utterly humiliating fiasco. The invasion was defeated not by Ptolemy's genius, but by the weather. As Demetrius's fleet sailed along the coast, a vicious storm blew in, wrecking many of his ships and scattering the rest. A naval landing was now impossible. Meanwhile, the same storms caused the Nile to flood, turning the river from a formidable barrier into an impassable sea. Antigonus's massive army arrived at the border of Egypt only to stare helplessly at a churning wall of water. Ptolemy, safe and secure on the other side, didn't have to lift a finger. After weeks of waiting for the weather to clear, with his army's supplies dwindling, Antigonus was forced to order a retreat. The great, decisive invasion had failed without a single battle. The new kings looked less like divine conquerors and more like fools who'd forgotten to check the forecast. Furious, and with their royal prestige taking a nosedive, they needed a victory. And they needed it now. Antigonus decided to make an example of someone who had defied them, the wealthy, independent island state of Rhodes. The Rhodians were naval and economic powerhouses who had tried to stay neutral, but their lucrative trade relationship with Ptolemy was an open secret. When Antigonus had demanded their aid for his invasion of Egypt, they had politely refused. This insult, combined with the need for a flashy win, made them the perfect target. In 305 BC, Antigonus sent his son Demetrius, now smarting from his own failure at sea, with a gargantuan force to besiege the city and bend it to his will. This is where Demetrius truly embraced his glam rock warlord persona and earned his famous nickname, Poliorcetes, the besieger of cities. He turned the siege of Rhodes into a year-long festival of terrifying, over-the-top military engineering. He didn't just bring catapults, he built super-heavy artillery capable of hurling 180-pound stones. But his masterpiece, his signature weapon, was a monstrosity called the Hellepolis, or Taker of Cities. It was a 9-story tall siege tower on wheels, 150 feet high, sheathed in iron plates to protect it from fire, and bristling with bolt throwers and stone catapults on every level. It was the Death Star of the ancient world, a weapon so massive it took over 3,000 men just to trundle it forward. The siege was an epic of attack and defense. Demetrius threw everything he had at the city walls. The Rhodians, brilliant engineers themselves, fought back with incredible courage and ingenuity. They knocked out the Hellepolis by flooding a ditch in front of their walls, causing the colossal machine to get stuck in the mud. They ran Ptolemy's naval blockade to bring in reinforcements and supplies. For a full year, the mightiest siege operation the world had ever seen failed to crack the defenses of one stubborn city. Cause, humiliated by their farcical failed invasion of Egypt, the Antigonids desperately need a major military victory to restore their prestige. Effect, Demetrius launches a massive, year-long siege of the city of Rhodes, employing unprecedented and gigantic siege engines, most famously the Hellepolis. Consequence, despite the spectacular technology and overwhelming force, the heroic defense of the Rhodians, supplied by Ptolemy, proves unbreakable. The siege ends in a negotiated settlement, a strategic failure for the Antigonids, though Demetrius ironically earned his famous nickname the Besieger for the sheer, audacious scale of his failed attempt. In the end, even Antigonus had to admit defeat. The siege was costing him a fortune in men and money, and he was achieving nothing. With other threats brewing elsewhere, he ordered Demetrius to accept a mediated peace. Rhodes retained its independence, and one of the most ironic twists in history, Demetrius walked away from his most spectacular failure with his most legendary title. It was the ultimate ancient world participation trophy. He didn't take the city, but he got a really cool nickname out of it. The Antigonid momentum was broken. Two major campaigns had ended in failure, and their enemies were beginning to smell blood in the water. The failures in Egypt and at Rhodes had cost the Antigonids dearly. Their aura of invincibility, so brightly polished after the Battle of Salamis, was now visibly tarnished. While the elder Antigonus licked his wounds, he sent his dynamic son Demetrius back to the one place where he had always found glory, Greece. For the next couple of years, from 304 to 300 to BC, Demetrius went on a triumphant rampage. He drove Cassander's forces from city after city, posturing as the great liberator of the Greeks. He was brilliant, he was glamorous, and he was winning. By 300 to BC, he had pushed Cassander's armies all the way back to the borders of Macedon itself. He stood poised to invade the homeland, crush the weakest of the rival kings, and claim the throne of Alexander for his father. Cassander was staring into the abyss. He was out of money, out of options, and outmaneuvered by a superior commander. In desperation, he sent a flurry of messengers to the other kings. His plea was urgent and existential. Help me. Demetrius is about to destroy me. Once he has the armies of Macedon, he and his father will be unstoppable. This is not my last stand. It is our last stand. The message hit its mark. The other kings, who had been watching Demetrius' successes with growing alarm, knew that Cassander was right. Lysimachus, Cassander's neighbor in Thrace, was the first to agree. He knew that if Macedon fell, he would be next on the Antigonid chopping block. Ptolemy, who had been fighting the Antigonids for a decade, also joined. He saw the wisdom in a coordinated strike. But the decisive voice came from the east. Seleucus, now the undisputed king of a vast empire stretching from Mesopotamia to the Indus, had survived years of brutal warfare against Antigonus. He was strong, he was secure, and he was ready to end this once and for all. The alliance was reborn, bigger and stronger than ever before. Cause Demetrius' brilliant campaign in Greece brings King Cassander to the verge of total defeat, prompting a desperate call for aid to the other successor kings. Effect, recognizing that an Antigonid conquest of Macedon would create an unbeatably powerful super-state, Lysimachus, Ptolemy, and Seleucus agreed to form a final, grand coalition to eliminate the Antigonid threat permanently. Consequence, the four allied kings launch a coordinated, multi-front assault on the Antigonid Empire, designed to force Antigonus and Demetrius into a single, decisive battle in Anatolia against their combined forces. This was the moment the other kids on the playground, after years of being picked on by the big bully, finally decided to team up for a coordinated attack. Their grand strategy was a masterpiece of coalition warfare. Lysimachus, reinforced by Cassander's remaining troops, would act as the vanguard, crossing from Europe into Anatolia to threaten the Antigonid heartland. This would be the bait. Ptolemy would invade Syria from the south, creating a diversion and pinning down Antigonid garrisons, and Seleucus would begin the long march west from Babylon with his massive eastern army. bringing a secret weapon that would change the face of the war. The ultimate goal was for Lysimachus and Seleucus to unite their armies deep inside Anatolia in the spring of 300 to BC. The plan was set in motion. Lysimachus crossed the Hellespont and began a highly successful campaign. Seizing a string of cities in western Anatolia, the bait had been taken. The 80-year-old Antigonus, seeing the grave danger to his homeland, had no choice but to react. He sent an urgent message to his son Demetrius in Greece, who was on the very cusp of final victory. The message was simple: come home, abandon the war with Cassander, we are under attack. Demetrius, forced to sign a truce and give up the prize he had worked so hard for, ferried his army across the Aegean to join his father. All the pieces were now in motion. The armies of the known world were converging on a single theater of war. The decades of backstabbing, of shifting alliances and endless conflict were all leading to this. One final, cataclysmic battle would now decide the fate of Alexander's world. As the great armies of the West began to converge on Anatolia, the final and most decisive piece of the puzzle was still in motion. Marching from the far side of the world, that piece was King Seleucus, and he wasn't just bringing an army, he was bringing a stampede. To understand the weapon he was about to unleash, we have to quickly look at what he'd been doing for the last decade. While the other kings were fighting over Greece and Syria, Seleucus had been fighting for his very survival in the brutal, multi-year Babylonian War. Antigonus had thrown army after army at him, trying to reclaim the lost province, and Seleucus, using clever tactics and the fierce loyalty of his people, had beaten them all. After finally securing his kingdom from Antigonus's attacks, Seleucus did something remarkable. He turned east. He marched his army in the footsteps of Alexander, conquering the vast upper satrapies of Persia, Bactria, and all the way to the edge of India. But when he reached the Indus River, he found that the world had changed. The politically fragmented Indian kingdoms Alexander had fought were gone, replaced by a new, unified superpower, the Mauryan Empire, forged by its brilliant founder, Chandragupta Maurya. Seleucus, ever the realist, knew he couldn't conquer this new Indian empire, so he did what smart rulers do. He made a deal. Around 303 BC, he signed a historic peace treaty with Chandragupta. He formally ceded the contested border territories in the Indus Valley lands. He could barely control anyway to the Mauryan Empire. In exchange, Chandragupta gave Seleucus a gift that would alter the course of history: 500 Indian war elephants. Let's be clear, this was not a small number. It was a strategic, war-winning arsenal. Cause, after securing his kingdom, Seleucus marches east and makes a pragmatic treaty with the powerful Indian Emperor Chandragupta Maurya to define their borders. Effect, in one of the most consequential trades in ancient history, Seleucus cedes fringe territories in exchange for an unprecedented force of 500 trained war elephants. Consequence, when the call for a final coalition against Antigonus arrives, Seleucus is able to march west not only with a massive, veteran army, but with a game-changing super weapon that will prove decisive in the final confrontation. A single elephant was a terrifying weapon on the battlefield. A few dozen could turn the tide of a battle. 500 was the ancient world's equivalent of a strategic bomber wing. They were living, breathing tanks, capable of smashing infantry lines, terrifying horses, and spreading chaos and panic wherever they went. It was a weapon of mass destruction, and Seleucus now had a monopoly on it. While the other kings had been fighting for cities, Seleucus had been acquiring an apocalypse on legs. So now, in the summer of 300 to BC, having received Cassander's desperate plea, this is the man who was marching west. His army was not fresh, it was a hardened, professional force of veterans who had spent a decade fighting and winning against Antigonus's best generals, and leading them was a rumbling, earth-shaking forest of tusks and armor. The long march from the heart of Asia to the plains of Anatolia was a monumental undertaking. A river of men and beasts flowing west towards the final battle. Lysimachus was the bait, Ptolemy was the diversion, but Seleucus and his elephants, they were the hammer, about to fall on the house of Antigonus. The winter of 300 to BC was a dangerous and desperate time for the coalition. Their grand plan hinged on their two main armies in Asia linking up, but for now, Lysimachus was all alone. Deep in enemy territory, he had successfully drawn the full attention of the Antigonid war machine. The aged but still formidable King Antigonus and his brilliant son King Demetrius had united their forces and were now bearing down on him with a significantly larger army. Lysimachus was no longer the hunter. He was the prey. His sole objective was to survive until the spring, when Seleucus was expected to arrive. What followed was a masterful display of strategic evasion. Antigonus, knowing his only chance was to crush Lysimachus before the Eastern army arrived, spent months trying to force a decisive battle. Lysimachus, crafty and resilient, refused to give him one. He played a brilliant game of cat and mouse across the Anatolian plateau, engaging in skirmishes, feinting attacks, and always retreating before he could be pinned down. He kept his army intact, his supply lines open via the Black Sea, and his eyes fixed on the eastern horizon. Meanwhile, the southern front of the Grand Alliance collapsed in a moment of characteristic caution. Ptolemy, as planned, had invaded Syria, but a false rumor, perhaps even deliberately planted by Antigonid agents, reached his camp. The rumor claimed that Antigonus had already caught and annihilated Lysimachus's army. Ptolemy, ever the pragmatist who valued the security of Egypt above all else, believed it. Fearing that Antigonus's victorious legions would now swing south and trap him, he immediately abandoned his campaign and retreated back behind the secure borders of the Nile. In a move dripping with irony, the man who had started the First War and been a central player for 2 decades would be absent from its final, decisive battle. As winter thawed into the spring of 301 BC, Lysimachus's desperate gamble paid off. The long-awaited reinforcements arrived. Seleucus, having completed his epic transcontinental march, linked up with Lysimachus's weary army in Phrygia, and with him came the elephants. The 2 allied kings now commanded a colossal force, strong enough to finally stop running and face their great enemy. Antigonus' primary strategy is to destroy Lysimachus' army in Anatolia before Seleucus' eastern army can arrive. Effect: Lysimachus executes a brilliant series of tactical retreats, avoiding a decisive confrontation and successfully preserving his army through the winter, until he unites with Seleucus and his 500 war elephants. Consequence: the successful merger of the 2 allied armies creates a force so formidable that it compels Antigonus and Demetrius to abandon their pursuit and instead march to meet them, leading both sides to deliberately seek out a single massive confrontation on the plains of Ipsus. The chase was over. Antigonus and Demetrius, having failed to destroy their enemies one by one, now had no choice but to face them together. They marched their own massive army, the finest fighting force in the world, to meet the combined forces of the coalition. The decades of simmering conflict, of betrayals and temporary truces, were about to come to a head. The 2 largest armies assembled since the death of Alexander the Great deliberately converged on a vast, open plain in the heart of Anatolia. The place was called Ipsus. This was it, the final act. To generations of ambition, dozens of legendary commanders, and the fate of the world's largest empire would be decided here in a single, bloody afternoon. The plain of Ipsus in central Anatolia was the chessboard for the final game. On one side stood the Antigonid dynasty, the 81-year-old King Antigonus, a titan of a bygone era, and his son, the brilliant King Demetrius. They commanded what was arguably the finest army in the world, with a battle-hardened infantry phalanx that had never been broken and a heavy cavalry contingent that was second to none. They had about 75 elephants. On the other side stood the coalition, the grizzled King Lysimachus and the canny King Seleucus. Their forces were roughly equal in number, but their infantry was a step below the Antigonid standard. Their advantage, however, was colossal and terrifying. It was Seleucus' secret weapon from the east, over 400 Indian war elephants. The Antigonid plan was the one they knew best, a classic hammer and anvil. Antigonus, a rock of a commander, would anchor the infantry phalanx in the center. Demetrius would take their elite cavalry on a thunderous charge to smash the enemy's flank. Once the enemy cavalry was broken, Demetrius would wheel his horsemen around and slam into the rear of the allied phalanx, which would then be crushed against Antigonus' advancing infantry. It was a simple, brutal, and highly effective plan that relied entirely on the speed and success of Demetrius' charge. The battle began just as Demetrius had planned, at the head of his cavalry. He crashed into the allied left wing with irresistible force. He was perhaps the greatest cavalry commander of his generation, and the coalition's horsemen shattered before him. They broke and fled the field, with Demetrius and his triumphant cavalry in hot pursuit. The first phase of the plan was a stunning success. The hammer was raised, ready to fall. And this is where the entire world changed. Demetrius, consumed by the thrill of the chase and the desire for a glorious, total victory, made a fatal mistake. He got greedy. Instead of immediately disengaging and turning back to the main battle to complete the hammer blow, he chased the routed enemy for miles, determined to wipe them out completely. His pursuit took him so far from the field that he effectively removed himself and the entire Antigonid cavalry advantage from the rest of the battle. Seleucus, commanding the allied right wing, saw the opening. It was a moment of pure tactical genius. Demetrius had left his father's infantry all alone, its flank completely exposed. But instead of charging, Seleucus did something unprecedented. He took a detachment of his elephants and simply moved them into the space between the returning Demetrius and the raging infantry battle. He created a wall, a living, breathing, terrifying wall of tusk and flesh that Demetrius and his horses could not get past. The chain of events was swift and brutal. Cause, the Antigonid cavalry, led by Demetrius, wins its engagement, but pursues the fleeing enemy to far from the battlefield. Effect, Seleucus brilliantly exploits the opening by using his elephants to form a screen, physically blocking Demetrius from rejoining the main battle, and leaving the Antigonid infantry isolated. Consequence, the Antigonid phalanx is surrounded and eventually broken. The 81-year-old King Antigonus is killed in the fighting, leading to the complete collapse of his army and the utter destruction of his empire. From across the field, Demetrius could only watch in horror. His horses, terrified by the elephants, refused to charge the living wall. He was trapped, a spectator at the death of his own kingdom. The main battle had become a slaughter. The Antigonid phalanx, leaderless and without cavalry support, was swarmed on all sides by the coalition's light troops and cavalry, while Seleucus's remaining elephants crashed into its flanks. The 81-year-old Antigonus stood his ground in the center of the chaos, bellowing for his son, refusing to believe that victory was slipping away. He was struck down by a hail of javelins the moment the old king fell. The army that had been invincible for decades shattered. Some surrendered, others fled. The battle was over. Demetrius, his father dead and his army gone, gathered what few men he could and fled. Antigonus the One-Eyed, the man who came closer than anyone to reuniting Alexander's empire, had lost it all in a single afternoon because his son couldn't resist the glory of the chase. The Battle of Ipsus was over. The dust settled on the bloody plain to reveal the corpse of an old king and the wreckage of his life's ambition. The coalition had won. The single greatest threat to their independent power was gone, and his vast empire, stretching from the Aegean Sea to the Euphrates, was now the grand prize in a geopolitical lottery. The first order of business for the victors Lysimachus and Seleucus, the men who had actually done the fighting, was to get out a map and start drawing new lines. The carving up of the Antigonid Turkey was a swift and ruthless affair. Lysimachus, as the senior partner in the Anatolian campaign, took the lion's share. He was awarded almost all of Asia Minor, the rich and strategic peninsula that formed the Antigonid heartland. Overnight, his provincial kingdom of Thrace was transformed into a major imperial power, controlling the vital land bridge between Europe and Asia. He was now a top-tier player. Seleucus, for his decisive contribution, was given northern Syria. This was a prize of immense strategic value. It gave his sprawling, landlocked Eastern Empire its first direct access to the Mediterranean, allowing him to build a navy and engage with the wider world. He would soon found a new capital there, Antioch, which would become one of the greatest cities of the age. Cassander, back in Macedon, received no new territory. His prize was simpler and more valuable: survival. The existential threat on his doorstep was gone. He was now the secure and uncontested king of Macedon and Greece. And what of Ptolemy, the king who had promised to help but had instead retreated to Egypt at the first sign of trouble? Hearing of the spectacular victory his allies had won without him, he opportunistically marched his army back into southern Syria, region known as Seal Syria, and occupied it, claiming it as his share. This move immediately created a new crisis. The victors were furious. Ptolemy had been a no-show for the main event, but now he wanted a cut of the prize money. They informed him that all of Syria had been promised to Seleucus. For a moment, it looked like the victorious coalition would immediately go to war with itself, but Seleucus, ever the diplomat, decided not to force the issue. He didn't want to fight his old friend and protector, Ptolemy. At least not yet. He formally maintained his claim to the region, but allowed Ptolemy to occupy it for the time being. This seemingly small decision was a seed of dragon's teeth. The dispute over Seal Syria would fester for generations, sparking a century of bloody wars between the Ptolemaic and Seleucid dynasties. Cause, the coalition's victory at Ipsus results in the complete collapse of the Antigonid Empire, leaving a massive territory to be divided among the victors. Effect, Lysimachus takes Anatolia and Seleucus takes northern Syria, transforming their kingdoms into major powers. The absentee Ptolemy opportunistically seizes southern Syria, creating a new point of conflict. Consequence, this final partition solidifies the existence of the major Hellenistic kingdoms, Ptolemaic Seleucid Lysimachuses and Cassander's Macedon, creating the new semi-permanent political map. of the post-Alexander world while simultaneously planting the seeds for the next 100 years of war. This was the moment the Hellenistic world finally took its lasting shape. The dream of a unified empire was dead and buried with Antigonus. In its place were for great rival powers. This new multipolar world was the true legacy of the successors. They had just fought the war to end all wars, and their first act as victors was to bicker over the spoils and create the pretext for the next one. But as they drew their new borders and congratulated themselves on their victory, they had forgotten one crucial detail. They had killed the old king, but they hadn't caught his son. Demetrius, the glam rock warlord, was still out there, and he still had a fleet. Demetrius Poliorcetes escaped the carnage at Ipsus with about 9,000 men and one colossal asset, the Antigonid navy. He was a king with no kingdom, a lord with no land, a ruler whose only territory was the deck of his flagship. His father was dead, his army was gone, and his empire was being devoured by his enemies. In this moment of utter desolation, he sailed to the one place he thought he could count on for refuge, Athens. He was their liberator, their patron, the man they had once worshipped with divine honors. He arrived at their port expecting open arms. Instead, he was met by a delegation that politely informed him that, as a matter of new policy, no kings were allowed in Athens. The betrayal was swift and absolute. The Athenians, ever the political survivors, had seen the results from Ipsus and immediately switched their allegiance to the winners. For Demetrius, it was a bitter and personal lesson in the transactional nature of loyalty. He was now truly alone, an outcast with a fleet. So he became a pirate king. For the next few years, Demetrius was the ultimate wild card, a terrifyingly powerful and unpredictable force in the Aegean Sea. He used his unmatched fleet to raid the coastlines of his enemies, disrupt their trade, and generally make life miserable for the new masters of the world. He was too strong on the sea to be ignored, but with no central land base, he was impossible to pin down and destroy. The neat for kingdom world that had emerged from Ipsus was not as stable as it looked. The victors, having eliminated their common enemy, immediately started eyeing each other with suspicion, and they all quickly realized that the homeless king with the giant fleet could be a very useful piece on the chessboard. The first to act was the biggest winner of all, Seleucus. Now the master of a vast Asian empire, Seleucus was wary of his powerful new neighbor Lysimachus, who controlled all of Anatolia. He needed a counterbalance. So, in a stunning diplomatic reversal, he sent an envoy to Demetrius with an incredible offer, the hand of Demetrius's daughter, Stratinus, in marriage. Cause, after the Battle of Ipsus, Demetrius loses his entire land empire, but retains command of a formidable navy, turning him into a powerful but homeless pirate king. Effect, his value as a mobile military power and a potential ally leads his former enemy, King Seleucus, to propose a strategic marriage alliance with him to counterbalance the other kings. Consequence, this unexpected alliance shatters the unity of the victorious post-Ipsus coalition, restores Demetrius's legitimacy and resources, and throws the Hellenistic world back into a state of fluid, multipolar conflict. For Demetrius, this was a golden opportunity. One day he was a pariah, the next he was being courted by the most powerful of the successor kings. He eagerly accepted. He sailed his entire fleet to the coast of Syria for a lavish royal wedding, a spectacular display of his enduring naval might. The alliance was a masterstroke for both men. It gave Seleucus a powerful naval ally against Ptolemy and Lysimachus, and it gave Demetrius what he so desperately needed: legitimacy, a powerful friend, and a fresh infusion of cash. This move sent the other kings into a panic. The post-Ipsus brotherhood was officially dead. Demetrius was the unkillable cockroach of the Hellenistic world. Just when everyone had counted him out, he had married his way back into the great game. In the world of the successors, there were no permanent enemies, only shifting interests and an endless supply of politically convenient marriage proposals. Demetrius was back on the board, and he was burning for revenge. His sights were now set on the man who held his father's old kingdom, Cassander, the king of Macedon. For a few years, Demetrius the pirate king was a nuisance the other monarchs could manage. But the game changed dramatically into 97 BC when his old rival, Cassander, died of natural causes. His dynasty proved to be pathetically weak. His sons immediately began a squalid, bloody civil war for the Macedonian throne. This was the moment Demetrius had been waiting for. Into 94 BC, one of Cassander's sons made the fatal mistake of inviting Demetrius to help him. Demetrius marched into Macedon, promptly murdered the prince who had invited him, and, through the sheer force of his charisma and military prestige, convinced the Macedonian army to proclaim him as their rightful king. In a stunning comeback, The landless fugitive had just seized the ancestral throne of Alexander the Great. Demetrius was a brilliant general, but he was a terrible king. He ruled Macedon with the flamboyant arrogance of a foreign conqueror, spending lavishly and treating the famously proud Macedonian nobility with contempt. More dangerously, he began building up a colossal army and fleet, making it perfectly clear that he intended to use Macedon as a launch pad to reconquer his father's entire Asian empire. And so, the cycle began again. The other kings, seeing the phoenix of the Antigonid dynasty rising from the ashes, were terrified. A new grand coalition formed to take him down. Lysimachus, now his direct neighbor, allied with the formidable King Pyrrhus of Epirus, a brilliant general from the west. They coordinated their attack, and even Ptolemy offered support. Into 88 BC, Lysimachus invaded Macedon from the east while Pyrrhus invaded from the west. Demetrius marched out to meet them, but his own army, fed up with his arrogance and deeply impressed by the more soldierly reputation of Pyrrhus, simply deserted him. For the second time in his life, Demetrius lost a kingdom overnight. He was forced to flee in disguise, a king once again without a country. He spent a few more years as a mercenary warlord in Asia before he was finally cornered and forced to surrender to his son-in-law, Seleucus, who kept him in luxurious confinement until he drank himself to death. The wild, chaotic career of Demetrius Poliorcetes was finally over. The power vacuum left by Cassander's death allows Demetrius to seize the throne of Macedon and build a new army, threatening to restore the Antigonid Empire. Effect: a new coalition of kings, fearing this resurgence, invades Macedon from two sides, causing Demetrius' own disaffected army to desert him and leading to his final downfall and death. Consequence: the main beneficiary of the victory is Lysimachus, who consolidates control over Macedon, Thrace, and most of Anatolia, forging a massive new superpower that directly rivals Seleucus' Eastern Empire, and sets the stage for one last war between the last two of Alexander's original companions. It's like watching the same story on a loop. A leader becomes the powerful, and the others unite to tear him down. The biggest winner of the Let's Get Demetrius sweepstakes was Lysimachus. He took control of Macedon and now ruled a vast, contiguous empire stretching from southern Greece all the way across Anatolia. He was powerful, he was rich, and at nearly 80 years old, he was at the absolute peak of his power. The world of the successors, which had begun with a dozen ambitious generals, was now down to just two of the original cast who still mattered. In the west, the titan was Lysimachus. In the east, the titan was Seleucus. Ptolemy in Egypt was ancient and on the verge of handing power to his son. The two old wolves, former friends and allies who had fought side by side at Ipsus, now glared at each other across a newly drawn border. There was only room for one of them at the top. The final battle was at hand. The final war, the one that ended the age of Alexander's companions, wasn't sparked by grand strategy or imperial ambition. It was sparked by a venomous family drama. King Lysimachus, now nearly 80, was under the influence of his young, brilliant, and utterly ruthless wife, Arsinoe, a daughter of Ptolemy. Arsinoe saw Lysimachus' eldest son and heir, the popular and capable Agathocles, as a threat to her own children's future. So, she did what any self-respecting Hellenistic queen would do. She convinced her aging husband that his own son was a traitor. Into 84 BC, Lysimachus, in a fit of paranoia and tyranny, had his own heir arrested and executed. This single act of filicide was a political earthquake. Agathocles had been beloved by the army and the cities of the kingdom. His murder horrified everyone. Lysimachus, once a respected veteran, now looked like a blood-soaked tyrant. His court descended into paranoia, and key governors, fearing they would be next on the chopping block, began to defect. The most important of these was Philetarus, the keeper of Lysimachus' enormous treasury at Pergamum. He switched his allegiance to the only other power left on the board, Seleucus. Seleucus, watching from across the border, had just been handed the perfect justification for war. He could invade not as a greedy conqueror, but as a noble avenger, a liberator freeing a kingdom from a king who murdered his own children. Into 81 BC, Seleucus, now 77 years old, marched his army into Anatolia for one last campaign. The war was swift. Lysimachus' kingdom, poisoned from within, crumbled. The two old men, the last of Alexander's generation, who had started as bodyguards and ended as kings, met for their final battle at a place called Corupedium. The details are sparse, but the result was decisive. Lysimachus, fighting bravely to the end, was killed. His army collapsed. Seleucus had won. He was the last man standing, after 42 years of brutal, ceaseless warfare. The great game was finally over, and he was the undisputed victor. Perdiccas, Craterus, Antipater, Antigonus, Cassander, Ptolemy, Lysimachus, they were all dead. He alone had survived. At 77, he was the master of an empire that stretched from Greece to India. He was Seleucus Nicator, the victor. His final act, he decided, would be to return to Macedon, the homeland he had not seen since he was a young man, and rule as its king. Cause, the tyrannical Lysimachus executes his own son and heir, triggering a massive political backlash that destabilizes his kingdom and prompts his enemies to support an invasion by Seleucus. Effect, Seleucus defeats and kills Lysimachus at the Battle of Corupedium, leaving him as the last surviving of Alexander's original successors, and the de facto ruler of the entire empire. Consequence, just days later as he is about to claim his final prize, Seleucus is assassinated by Ptolemy Kronos, an ungrateful refugee prince, in a final pathetic betrayal that abruptly ends the life of the ultimate victor, and closes the age of the Diadochi. As he crossed the Hellespont into Europe, ready to claim his final prize, Seleucus was accompanied by a guest he had taken in, a refugee prince named Ptolemy Kronos. This Kronos, or Thunderbolt, was the disinherited son of the first Ptolemy, and Seleucus had offered him shelter. As the old king paused to offer a sacrifice at an altar, Kronos, the man whose cause he had championed, walked up behind him and stabbed him in the back, killing him instantly. Why? Because with both Lysimachus and Seleucus dead, Kronos saw his chance to seize the army and claim Macedon for himself. Seleucus had outplayed, outfought, and outlived the most ruthless generation of leaders in history. He won the game, and his prize was to be murdered by a treacherous freeloader he had taken pity on just moments before he could step on the finish line. It was the most pathetic, ironic, and perfectly fitting end to the story of the Diadochi. A final reminder that in their world, there was no honor, no gratitude, and no such thing as a happy ending. And that is how a group of friends tore the largest empire in the world to shreds, and created the modern Middle East, all while being the absolute worst people imaginable. Just a quick reminder, please, for the love of all that is holy, do not use this podcast as a source for your history paper. Your professor will cry. But if you had way more fun than you ever thought you could learning about 40 years of backstabbing, then you know what to do. Hit that subscribe button and maybe drop a comment below suggesting another historical train wreck you'd like us to oversimplify. We're always looking for new and exciting ways to be historically irresponsible, and that's how that whole mess went down. Until next time, don't invade Russia in the winter.